To begin with, you might need to talk about the Native American way of life before they came into conflict with the white Americans. In the exam, when you are talking about the Native Americans, please don't call them natives. Call them Native Americans or Plains Indians. Either is acceptable, but avoid just calling them natives. Now, the Native Americans, or Plains Indians, were nomadic. That meant that they travelled around. The reason that they travelled around was because they followed the buffalo herds. There was really no other food to eat on the Great Plains, so that's why they had to hunt the buffalo. They used the buffalo for food, but they also then used the buffalo hide to make their teepees and their clothes, and they used the bones of the buffalo to make their weapons and tools. If the buffalo were not there, they would have nothing to eat and nothing to make their material from. They lived in teepees, which are a type of tent. That means it could be moved around, so it could be packed up and moved to a new place. It was made of buffalo hide. They were quite good in summer because the sides could be rolled up so that they could let fresh air in, but in winter it would protect them from the snow. The Native Americans were not Christian, but they were very religious. They believed in the spirit world. The great spirit who had created the earth was called Wakantanka. They believed that they could communicate with the spirit world and the spirit world would guide them. They relied on horses. Horses were essential. That's because they used the horses to catch the buffalo. They were not fast enough to run after the buffalo unless they were on horseback. And then to hunt the buffalo, they would use either spears or bows and arrows. Horses were also used in warfare because the Native American tribes went to war against each other often. For example, the Sioux were enemies with the Crow, and therefore war would break out with them. So during warfare, the warriors of the tribe or of the band would ride on horseback and go and raid a rival band's camp. They would try and steal their horses. They might try and steal other things like weapons. Native American warfare, when it was between the tribes, wasn't usually about killing, because actually there was only small numbers of Native Americans in each band. So usually there was not that many deaths when they were going to war against each other. It was more about stealing things, such as horses. They would carry a stick called a coop stick, and the idea was to hit your enemy with it. Not kill your enemy, but hit your enemy with it, to show how brave you were of getting close to your enemy. One of the things they did do to each other was to scalp each other, which means to cut the top of the head, the skin from the top of the head off. And then that scalp was a sign of your success in battle. If someone was scalped, usually they probably would die, but they didn't always die. It was possible to survive after you had been scalped. Now, in Native American society, everybody had a role. So for the men, it was to hunt the buffalo and to go to war. For the women, it was to look after the teepee, prepare the food, make the clothing, look after the children. For the children, as soon as they were old enough, they had to learn how to ride horses, because obviously that was important for moving around and for hunting. But even the women had to ride the horses because they had to travel on them. The elderly were seen as very wise, so they had a very important part in society. They would give advice on things like warfare. They would also help to raise the children, teach them how to use a bow and arrow, for example. Native Americans were not one big group of people. They were split into different tribes, and they saw themselves as very separate from each other. For example, you might have the Cheyenne tribe or the Sioux tribe. Within each tribe, they were then split into smaller bands. So, for example, all of the Sioux didn't all live together because there were thousands of them, so they didn't all live together. They lived in smaller bands. Each band had a chief. The chief was then in charge of the band, but the chief didn't just make all the decisions by himself. He had to make the decisions with his council, which would have the elderly from the tribe in it, as well as all of the warriors in the tribe, so the men from the tribe. There may also be some elderly women on the council as well. And they would then make decisions together, such as whether to go to war against another tribe, where they should go next to look for the buffalo, where they could find water, things like that. Things massively changed for the Native Americans from about 1830. This is when the sort of conflicts between the white Americans and the Native Americans really began. And it started with the Indian Removal Act in 1830. The aim of this act was to completely separate Native Americans from white Americans. And what it did was force all Native Americans who were living to the east of the Mississippi River to the west of the Mississippi River. So there was already a lot of Native Americans to the west of the Mississippi, but it was just making all of them go to the west of the Mississippi River. That is why it's called the Removal Act, because it was about moving the Native Americans who did live in the east over to the west of the Mississippi River. The Native Americans who were forced to move were not happy. They didn't want to leave the lands that they had lived on. However, when they were moved to the west of the Mississippi River, this created a division between the two sides. So to the east of that river, you had the white Americans. To the west of that river, you had the Native Americans. And that, in some ways, was much better for the Native Americans because they could just then get on with life as they wanted. The land to the west of the Mississippi River became known as Indian Territory. And in 1830, the Native Americans were promised, you can have Indian Territory forever. It is yours permanently. You don't have to give it up, and no white Americans will come there. So in some ways, this was actually a positive thing for the Native Americans because they have this humongous area of land and they're being told it is permanently theirs, that it is Indian Territory, and they'll be left alone. A few years later, the Trade and Intercourse Act is passed, and that said that there would be basically no trade between the Native Americans and the white Americans. For example, the Native Americans would not be allowed to buy guns from the white Americans. So again, it's just trying to keep the two sides very separate and making sure there's limited contact. And that was the idea at the time of this early period, is just to completely separate the two groups from each other. And that is how the Native Americans preferred it, because on the Great Plains, called Indian Territory, they could carry on hunting the buffalo and living their traditional way of life. The issue then came in the 1840s because more and more white Americans decided to move to Oregon and California in the 1840s. Now, the reason for this is that Oregon and California became part of the USA. They gained Oregon from Britain through an agreement, and then they won California in a war against Mexico. So suddenly the USA is not just in the east, the USA also has land over in the west. And thousands of Americans then wanted to go over to the west to start a new life. At this time, in the 1840s, they are not allowed to live on Indian territory, but what they do is pass through it on the Oregon Trail and the California Trail. Now, this was against the Indian Removal Act, because as part of the Indian Removal Act, the point was that people were not meant to be going into Indian territory. But because the Oregon Trails and California Trails went through Indian territory, thousands of people started walking through. As a result, the US government sent the US Army into Indian territory to protect the trails and to keep the Native Americans separate from the white travellers that were going across. This obviously made the Native Americans pretty angry because they had sort of been promised, this is your land, no one's going to come there. And then suddenly you've got lots and lots and lots of people walking through, as well as army, the US Army are there as well, on what the Native Americans saw as their land. Now, on that note, Native Americans don't think that you can own land. They think that land is land and it can't be owned by one person. But as part of the Indian Removal Act, they had been told that no white people would go to Indian territory. So they believe that although they don't own Indian territory personally, they believe that no white people should be going there because it's, you know, it's for their use. Although they don't own it, it is for them and them only to use. And therefore white people shouldn't be going there. So this is really the start of this massive conflict, because instead of being kept completely separately, one side to the west of the Mississippi River and the other side to the east of the Mississippi River, now the two sides were coming into conflict. But in the 1840s, no white people were actually living on the Great Plains. They were just travelling through to get to Oregon and California. Now, things start to go quite badly in the 1850s between the Native Americans and the US government. And that's because the US government changed kind of what they want to do. In the 1830s, they had promised the Native Americans that they could have Indian territory forever and that white people wouldn't go there. Obviously, that had changed because in the 1840s, people did start to go through Indian territory. But in 1851, the government make a new law called the Indian Appropriations Act. And this really shows us that the government had changed their minds completely about Indian territory. And their new plan was to actually start taking land off the Native Americans and force the Native Americans instead to live on smaller areas of land called reservations. And this decision was made in 1851 when the Indian Appropriations Act was passed. Now, this was not communicated to the Native Americans. They didn't really explain this to the Native Americans, but it was passed by the US government to say what we are going to do in the long term, not straight away, but in the long term, we are going to reduce the land the Native Americans have and force them to live on these reservations. The rest of the land of Indian territory would then become part of the kind of white America. But that was a long-term plan. That was not done immediately in 1851, but that was clearly what they had decided they were going to do in the long term. In the same year, they make the Fort Laramie Treaty with the Native Americans. And I think that the promises that they make in the Fort Laramie Treaty, they kind of didn't really have any intention of sticking to them in the long run. The Fort Laramie Treaty came about because white travellers were being attacked by Native Americans on the Oregon Trail and the California Trail. And the government wanted it to stop. But obviously the Native Americans were very angry because suddenly they've got thousands of people travelling through what they see as their land. And therefore they don't want that to happen, and therefore they're attacking the travellers. So hence the Fort Laramie Treaty was needed. What they decide is that they need to sit down together, the US government and the chiefs from the Plains Indians tribes. Now that was very difficult because there was a lot of chiefs. Every band had a chief, and only some of them agreed to go to this meeting. So this Fort Laramie Treaty, this agreement that was made, actually wasn't agreed to by all of the different chiefs. But some of them went and they agreed. So the two sides sat down together and they both made promises. The Native Americans promised they would stop attacking the migrants who were on the California and Oregon trails. They also promised they would allow a railway to be built across Indian Territory. In return, the US government promised that they would not allow any white Americans to go and live on Indian Territory. They also promised that they would protect the Native Americans from the white travellers, and they also promised to provide the Native Americans with $50,000 worth of food every year for each tribe. So the Fort Laramie Treaty is like both sides are making promises. But unfortunately, it didn't really work. Because the main promise the Native Americans made was to stop attacking the white migrants on the Oregon and California trails. But actually, they carried on. They carried on attacking the travellers. Most Native Americans had not actually signed the treaty. They never actually agreed to it, and they didn't feel that they had to follow it. So the attacks continued. On the government side, they also broke their promises, because their big promise in the Fort Laramie Treaty is that no Native Americans would be, no white Americans could go and live on the plains. But actually, they allow them to go and live on the plains. Because in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act is passed. And this basically opens up parts of Indian Territory for white settlers to go and live on. Kansas and Nebraska were part of Indian Territory. In the Fort Laramie Treaty, the US government had promised we will not allow white settlers to go and live on Indian Territory. And then 3 years later, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, they allow people to go and live on the plains. So the US government massively break the Fort Laramie Treaty. And also so do the Native Americans, because they are still attacking the white migrants. And then when people start settling on the land after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, they start attacking them as well. So the Native Americans continue to attack the white travellers and the white settlers, but the government have broken their promise and they have allowed people to go and live on the plains from 1854. This then just gets worse as we go into the 1860s because of the Homestead Act. More and more and more people are going to live on the plains, which the Native Americans were promised in 1830 and then 1851. They were promised that that was their land and that no white Americans would come and live on it. That was what they were promised. And that promise was obviously broken. Now, they had agreed to the railroad being built. So that was something that they had agreed to. But they had never agreed to the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Homestead Act, because that brought people to live on the plains, which they thought was their land. Now, they didn't believe that people could own land. That was a Native American belief. They didn't believe the land could be owned, but they believed that that land was for their use and their use only, because they'd been promised that in 1830 and 1851. So they thought that that was completely unacceptable, that white people were now coming to live on Indian territory. In the 1860s, the situation between the Native Americans and the US government deteriorated into war. We have 3 wars in the 1860s that we refer to as the Plains Wars. The first was Little Crow's War. Little Crow was the chief of the Santee Sioux. The Santee Sioux had been forced to live on a reservation. This reservation had very poor land, so they were unable to grow any food, and they were reliant on the government to give them food. In the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty, the government had promised to provide the reservations with food. The Santee Sioux, however, had not been given any food, and they were unable to grow their own on their reservation. So therefore, they turned to violence. They attacked government workers, they attacked the US Army, and they attacked townspeople who lived in towns near their reservation. 700 people were killed by the Santee Sioux. As a result, the US government sent in reinforcements and sent in a huge number of US Army soldiers to crush Little Crow's rebellion. The Santee Sioux were stopped and were arrested, sort of rounded up, and all of them were sort of taken captive by the US Army. Their punishment was to be forced to go and live on an even smaller reservation where the conditions were even worse. There was also around 30 members of the Santee Sioux who were executed because of their involvement in the killings. So in the end, the US government won Little Crow's War. The Santee Sioux were defeated and were sent to live on a smaller bit of land where they were unable to rebel again. Next came the Cheyenne War, which was an even bigger war because there were several different battles between the US Army and the Cheyenne. Now, the situation with the Cheyenne kicked off because the Cheyenne had been promised certain lands as part of the Fort Laramie Treaty, which was signed in 1851. And the Cheyenne believed, well, as the treaty said, that that land was just for them and no white Americans would go onto the Cheyenne lands. However, gold was then found in the Rocky Mountains. So thousands of miners started going to the Rocky Mountains and travelling through Cheyenne lands to get there. This made the Cheyenne furious. And instead of attacking straight away, however, they went to the US government and said, "You promised this was our land, and now there's all these miners walking through our land, invading our land." The solution that the government came up with did not please the Cheyenne, because their solution was to move the Cheyenne to a smaller bit of land, a small reservation. Obviously, the Cheyenne weren't happy about that, and then violence broke out between the two sides. And as I say, there was several battles. One of the most kind of nasty events of the Cheyenne War was when there was a group of Cheyenne, and they were with their chief, who was called Black Kettle, and Black Kettle was waving a white flag, which means surrender. But the US Army attacked them anyway and killed a large number of the Cheyenne, including women and children. This was called the Sand Creek Massacre. There were several other battles in the Cheyenne War, including the Battle of Washita, but in the end, the Cheyenne had to surrender because they were just beaten by the US government. The US Army were much stronger. They had more guns, they had more men, and the Cheyenne were just not able to fight back. So eventually, after many years and a lot of fighting, all of the Cheyenne eventually did go to the small Cheyenne reservation. So once again, the US Army had won because they were stronger, and also because they used quite brutal tactics. I've already mentioned the fact that they killed women and children sometimes, but they also did things like destroying all the Native American food, destroying Native American teepees. This is called total war, and it was a tactic to basically starve the Native Americans and mean that the Native Americans had nowhere to live, so that would force them into surrender. The final war of the Plains Wars that you need to know about is Red Cloud's War. And this war was very different to the other two, because this was actually a success for the Native Americans. Red Cloud was a Sioux chief, and he was sort of in charge of a large group of Sioux. However, miners on their way to mine gold started coming through Sioux lands. This was land that the Sioux had been promised was theirs in the Fort Laramie Treaty. And yet, thousands of miners were travelling through the Sioux lands along what became known as the Bozeman Trail, because they were on their way to get gold. Not only were people walking through, but also the US Army also then came onto Sioux lands. That was because they were trying to protect the miners, and they built army forts through Sioux land all along the Bozeman Trail. So obviously the Sioux, led by Red Cloud, were not happy about this. They've suddenly got army forts all over what they class as their land. So what they start doing is they start attacking the soldiers, but not in a big battle. What they did was they would wait, hiding, until small groups of soldiers left the army forts to get wood and water, and then they would ambush them and kill them. Every time the soldiers tried to come out of their forts in small groups, they would be surrounded and attacked by large groups of Red Cloud's Native Americans. This was a really successful tactic, and in the end, the US Army gave up. They thought it was too difficult to try and stop Red Cloud because he had too many warriors and they were all split into different groups. So the US Army would have had to try and find all of the different little groups of Red Cloud's Sioux. They just thought it was too much hassle and too dangerous because lots of the US soldiers had already died every time they tried to come out of the forts. So what the US government did was they agreed to close the Bozeman Trail, burn down the army forts, and leave the Sioux alone, and prevent any more miners going through the Sioux lands. Red Cloud has won, and the US government had given up, the US Army had given up. Red Cloud's war was the only one that we would say was successful.
The other really important reason that you need to know that Red Cloud's War was a success was because at the end of Red Cloud's War, the Sioux and Red Cloud signed the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 with the government. This is a different treaty to the one that was signed in 1851. It's got the same name, but it was different, because the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 created the Great Sioux Reservation. So therefore a large area of land was given to the Sioux, and it was promised it would be theirs. This land included the Black Hills, which was a very sacred, important place for the Sioux. So not only had they managed to beat the army and get the army to leave their land, they had this new treaty, the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty, that was guaranteeing them that that land was theirs, the Great Sioux Reservation. Now, following on from that, we have a new president called President Grant. And he did not like the fact that there had been so many wars against the Native Americans. In the 1860s, there had been quite a lot of people whose attitude we can call extermination. They were the exterminators. Their attitude was that the army should deal with any problems with the Native Americans, and if necessary, to shoot the Native Americans. President Grant did not believe in that extermination policy. He believed in the negotiation policy. Now that sounds nicer, and it was, because it was about having less aggression and less killing. But the negotiation policy, what that really meant was that President Grant wanted to move the Native Americans all onto reservations, educate them and teach them English, make them be Christian, make them go to schools, and make them live like white farmers. And this is what President Grant called his peace policy. So it was about no more war and getting the Native Americans on reservations, getting them to speak English, getting them to be Christian, their children to go to schools, and them to just basically live like a white lifestyle. And that is called cultural assimilation. Now, obviously, the Native Americans didn't like that because they didn't want to live on the reservations, and they didn't want to become Christian. They didn't want to speak English. They didn't want to farm. And remember, the reservations that they're forced to live on are awful. They're not given good land. They're given such poor land that then they really struggle to grow anything on that land, and therefore they rely on government handouts of food. So they're becoming kind of helpless. Whereas what they want to do is be free to go around hunting the buffalo. But by the 1860s, hunting the buffalo was becoming increasingly difficult for the Native Americans. Partly because they were being forced to live on the reservations, which for a lot of them, there was no buffalo on them. But also there was an increase in buffalo hunting from white Americans. The train was finished in 1869, and the train then brought lots of buffalo hunters to the plains. The people who built the train, so the train builders, they had also been hunting the buffalo. Famously, we have Buffalo Bill, who kills a huge amount of buffalo while he is there trying to feed the railway builders. However, after that, after the train's actually built, we have people just coming because they see it as a sport. They want to hunt the buffalo because they think it's fun. Whereas the Native Americans were struggling to hunt the buffalo because they're being forced to live on these reservations. And this is what President Grant calls his peace policy. It's basically keeping the Native Americans prisoner on these reservations, because if they tried to leave, the army would be there to stop them. That was okay for the Sioux because they had quite a lot of land because they'd had the Great Sioux Reservation, and their land was sort of bigger and better. But a lot of the tribes, their reservations were very, very small and poor quality. Something else that President Grant did was bring in the Indian Appropriations Act of 1871. This was the second Indian Appropriations Act. There had been one passed in 1851, which had started the process of creating reservations. This one, signed in 1871, 20 years later, declared that Native Americans would only be treated as individual American citizens, not as tribes anymore. Now that was significant because obviously the tribes had been promised all sorts of things. But if the government is saying, right now we are not going to see you as a tribe, we are just going to see you as individual people, that meant that anything that the tribes had previously been promised no longer applied. Therefore, the government could go in there and take land away from tribes that they promised that land to, but now they're saying, oh, but we're treating you all as individuals. So you can own individual land, but the tribe's land is no longer a thing. So that's quite a negative, disastrous thing for the Native Americans. And the Indian Appropriations Act of 1871 therefore led to tribes losing the land that they had been promised. One of the other disastrous things that happened for the Native Americans in the 1870s is the destruction of the southern buffalo herd. There was the buffalo were in two main herds, the northern herd and the southern herd. And there had been a huge increase in white people going to the plains to hunt buffalo in the 1870s. Firstly, they went to just do it for fun and also for the meat. Then as time went on, they realised that they could make a lot of money from selling the buffalo hide because they could make it into leather. So what started happening is hunters were going to the plains and killing huge numbers of buffalo, then just cutting their hide off, their skin and their fur, and just taking that to then take it to be made into leather for profit. Mostly, they then just left the body of the buffalo to rot. So what happened was the plains were just covered in buffalo bones. Then later, other people would come to get the bones because they could melt them down and make them into things like glue. So obviously the destruction of one of the buffalo herds was an absolute disaster for the Native Americans. Obviously they were restricted in hunting the buffalo anyway because they were mostly on reservations, but quite a lot of the Native Americans were still able to hunt some of the buffalo. But obviously after 1875, there was no buffalo left on the southern plains. Think about how many buffalo had to have been killed by these buffalo hunters for the southern herd to have been destroyed. There had been millions of buffalo on the plains in the 1830s, and now, by this point, the whole southern herd was completely wiped out. The Native Americans had only ever hunted a small amount of buffalo at a time, whereas these hunters were killing hundreds of thousands at a time. As time went on, another war broke out. Think about the fact that even though President Grant thought his peace policy was brilliant, the reality was that the Native Americans were still not happy because they didn't want to live on these reservations. They didn't want to be white farmers. So there is still tension. But then gold is found in the Black Hills. The Black Hills were part of the Great Sioux Reservation, and they were extremely important to the Sioux. The Sioux believed the spirits of their ancestors lived in the Black Hills. When gold was found in the Black Hills, the government offered to pay the Sioux to buy the Black Hills from them. But the Sioux refused because they were so important to their religious beliefs. So the Sioux refused to sell the Black Hills. So the government responded by sending the army in to the Black Hills and to the Great Sioux Reservation. The Sioux were warned to leave the area of the Black Hills, and they were warned they must all remain in the other parts of the Great Sioux Reservation. The army then went in to make sure that miners could get to the Black Hills. The army then decided that they were going to go and fight against the Native Americans to force them away from the Black Hills and to force them to reduce the size of the Great Sioux Reservation. So the army go in. The Native Americans are waiting at a place called the Little Bighorn. It was the name of a river. The Native Americans had around 2,000 warriors gathered at the Little Bighorn with their chiefs, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. Now, the US Army were in several different units and they were approaching from different sides to try and surround the Native Americans. The unit led by Custer had around 600 soldiers and they arrived at the Little Bighorn first. When they got there, what they were meant to do was stay hidden and not attack until the other army units got there. But Custer thought he was brilliant. He was overconfident and he thought if he attacked, he could become famous and win this huge battle with just his 600 soldiers. Now he had Native American scouts who were spying on the Sioux for him. And they warned him not to attack. They said there's too many warriors on the Little Bighorn. So there's about 2,000 Sioux warriors. But Custer wouldn't listen and he decided to attack anyway, even though he only had 600 soldiers. So he went to attack and the Native Americans with their 2,000 warriors, and they had a lot of guns as well. I think Custer was not expecting the Native Americans to have so many guns, but they did. And Custer goes in and attacks and his whole troop of soldiers is wiped out. All of them die, including Custer. It is an absolute huge victory for the Native Americans because they have, beaten the US Army at this huge battle, the Battle of Little Bighorn. Now, the Battle of Little Bighorn was obviously a big success for the Native Americans, but it soon led to revenge from the US government. They could not accept that they had lost, and what they then did was send in more troops to round up the rest of the Sioux. The Sioux were then forced onto a small reservation. So they lost the Great Sioux Reservation and were forced onto a small one. This reservation, obviously, terrible conditions. The land was poor, so they struggled to grow food. The water was limited and diseases broke out very often. And there was lack of any kind of medical supplies or any medical training to deal with those disease outbreaks. So the Battle of Little Bighorn was a very short-term success. Eventually, the Sioux were all rounded up, forced onto these small reservations, and they lost the Great Sioux Reservation. So although they won the Battle of Little Bighorn, they lost the Great Sioux War. Following the Battle of Little Bighorn and the Great Sioux War, the government took a very, very firm approach to the Native Americans. They didn't want any more wars, but they felt they needed to kind of be more forceful with the Native Americans. So all Native Americans were forced onto reservations in the 1880s. By this point, a lot of them were already on the reservations, but any remaining Native Americans not on a reservation were forced onto a reservation. A lot of the reservations were also reduced in size in the 1880s to make them smaller. The reservations were then surrounded by US soldiers to stop the Native Americans leaving. They were prisoners on these reservations. As I've already discussed, the conditions on these reservations were appalling in terms of lack of food, lack of water, the spread of diseases, and lack of any kind of medical facilities or medical equipment or medicines or anything like that. Not only that, but the government embarked on a policy of cultural genocide. This is not killing. This is trying to eradicate and remove the Native American culture. So, for example, they were forced to speak English instead of their own Native American languages. The powers of the chiefs were removed. For example, the chief had no legal powers to punish any Native Americans. In the past, if there had been an issue where a Native American had done something wrong, the chief had the ability to issue some kind of punishment to members of his own tribe. That kind of punishment was done within the tribe. The chief lost all those powers. If any Native American was found to have done something wrong, they would go to a normal American law court. The powers of the chief were just not recognised at all. So the government did not listen to the chiefs anymore and did not negotiate with the chiefs anymore. The chief was just seen as any other Native American. They had no power to kind of make any decisions any longer. The Native American religion was also banned. They were forced to become Christians. The people who were put in charge of the reservations were Christians. Early on, when reservations were first introduced, we had Indian agents who were in charge of them, who were just white government workers, but they were called Indian agents because they were in charge of the reservations. But by the 1880s, it was religious Christian people that were in charge of the reservations because they were then forcing the Native Americans to become Christian. One of the most devastating and horrible things was the fact that then children started to be taken away from the Native American reservations and forced to go to boarding schools. These boarding schools, again, would be run by Christians, and they would take the children away. They might not see their parents for years. They would be taught English, they'd be taught to read and write, they would be taught how to be a good Christian, completely separated from their families. This was absolutely devastating because these children were very, very young, and these boarding schools were horrific. The abuse that went on there was massive, sort of physical abuse, but also things like sexual abuse as well. These children were traumatized by those experiences, and so were their parents because they'd had their children taken away from them. Why did they do it? Well, they were forced. The army would point guns at them to hand their children over, but also because on these reservations the land was so poor, they relied on the government for food. So if they didn't send their children to these reservations, they would be given no food and they would starve, and their children would starve. So they had no choice but to hand their children over. Absolute devastation. The Dawes Act was then passed in 1887. This said that instead of a large reservation, well, not, you know what I mean, like a large-ish reservation for the whole tribe, each individual Native American family would have their own bit of land, so their own individual farm. So this was the idea of kind of breaking up the reservations into small farms. Because remember, what they want is the Native Americans not to live as a tribe, they just want them to live as American citizens. So again, this is trying to reduce the power of the chief. Because while they all live communally on a big reservation, the chief is still kind of got some kind of power over the community. But when the Dawes Act was passed, instead of the chief kind of looking out for the whole reservation, each individual family just had their own bit of land. So it's that weakening of that tribal structure, weakening of the kind of the chiefs in charge, and they all lived together as a tribe. They were just individuals. So again, this made them even more unhappy because they couldn't sort of live together as the tribe anymore. They were seen as very separate individual plots of land. The last kind of law that then is brought in is another Indian Appropriations Act. So this is the third one. So the first one kind of started setting up reservations. The second one said that Native Americans would be seen as individuals, not as a tribe. And this third one said that the land that Native Americans had in Oklahoma was going to be sold off to white settlers. So Oklahoma was one of the last places where Native Americans had quite a bit of land. But from 1889, that land was taken away and sold off, and it led to the Oklahoma land rush. And it meant that, you know, they'd lost, again, huge amounts of land. So by 1889, the only land that Native Americans had were left was those kind of small reservations that were dotted around the place that had then been sort of divided up into the small plots of land. And that was all they had. And remember, they're not allowed to leave those areas. They're forced to stay on that land they've been given. And they were desperate. They were reliant on the government for food. And they were, you know, had so much of their culture and way of life destroyed. By 1890, the northern buffalo herd had also been destroyed by the white buffalo hunters, who were hunting the buffalo for profit, for their hide to turn into leather and their bones to melt down. At this point, the Native Americans start a new dance movement called the ghost dance. Religious dances had always been part of Native American culture. For example, they had done the buffalo dance to try and give them good luck when they went to hunt the buffalo. They had powerful religious beliefs, and the Native Americans believed that if every Native American did the ghost dance for long enough, then the white Americans would all disappear, the buffalo would come back to life, and the Native Americans could live how they had used to. This movement spread, and the ghost dance was being done by large numbers of Native Americans. The government then stepped in and decided to ban the ghost dance because they thought it was going to lead to a big rebellion. So they banned it. But obviously the Native Americans carried on doing it. So the US government sent in the army to arrest anybody found to be doing the ghost dance. And that included Sitting Bull and Bigfoot, who were chiefs, and obviously their Native American bands as well. When the US Army went in, Sitting Bull was killed, and Bigfoot and the group of Native Americans he was with were arrested, and they were taken to a place called Wounded Knee. At Wounded Knee, fighting broke out. We're not 100% sure why, but fighting broke out between the prisoners and the US Army. It was absolutely devastating. 146 Native Americans were killed and 25 soldiers. A lot of the 146 Native Americans who died were children. This was a devastating event for the Native Americans, with so many children killed just because they'd been getting involved in the ghost dance. This event, this kind of fighting that happened at Wounded Knee and the killing of so many Native American children, ended the Native American struggle. After that, Native Americans had to accept their situation and live on the reservations. In 1890, the US government decided that they had won the plains and declared that that was so. The Native Americans could no longer fight back anymore.